Hey everyone, this is Greg with Spotted Tongue Woodworking. In this video, I'd like to go over how I approach projects that require a paint finish, the equipment that I use, and the individual steps that make up my entire paint process. In other words, spraying paint for dummies. Before I begin painting, I go over every piece and fill in any imperfections and sand them smooth. Any and all sanding I do at this point, I use a vacuum to try to control any free-floating dust and keep the surfaces clean for a smooth paint finish. This little Festool orbital sander is the perfect finish sander that has just enough bite to work through some rough stuff, but really shines when doing finish work, preparing for stain, paint, or sanding between coats of finish. Having moved into a new shop recently, I've been able to set up a dedicated space specifically for spraying paint and finishes. It's still all the same equipment that I was using in my old shop, but just in a larger space. In the little spray booth, I have ram board taped to the floor, painter's plastic draped from the ceiling, and box fans with air filters taped on them in order to try to control any overspray and prevent it from floating around the shop and covering everything with a fine dust. Over the past few years, I have tried numerous primers and paints in order to figure out what I think works best for me. High-end cabinet paint isn't cheap, but will last longer and give a better finish than the trim paint from your local paint store. Most of the projects that I have done recently, I have used Target Coatings' M-Tech line of products. It is a quick-drying, water-based pigmented lacquer with amazingly short recoat times, which means a quicker turnaround and more productivity during the day. I use the Spectrum siphon gun from Harbor Freight, and yes, I know Harbor Freight sells a lot of crap, but they sell excellent guns for the money that provide a super low barrier for entry to get into spraying paint and to actually be able to have a good finish. The key component of my paint setup is my compressor. It's not the biggest or the most powerful compressor out there, but it's quiet and big enough for most of my painting needs. I chose to go with a compressor-based HVLP, high volume low pressure system, for a few reasons. Some personal, some practical, and some just because. The thing I like most about an HVLP system over an airless system is that an HVLP system will use about 1/3 to 1/2 of the paint that an airless system will go through. Less paint means lower material costs, and less paint also means less mess to worry about. I chose a compressor over a turbine system because a turbine system will begin to blow hot air after continued use, and the constant vacuum cleaner sound drives me crazy whenever I try to use them. The big advantage, though, of a turbine HVLP system over a compressor HVLP system is the portability, as it's a pretty big hassle to haul this compressor around and get it set up. As for an airless system, because they spray so much paint in such a short amount of time, they are extremely useful for painting large projects or large numbers of doors and drawer fronts. I like the idea of an airless, as any HVLP system will paint much slower than any airless system, but the reality is that I find it's much easier to control the overspray of an HVLP system. The HVLP system leaves a slightly finer finish, and it's easier for me to clean out just the HVLP gun and cup rather than having to flush out and clean an entire airless system between jobs. Now that all the pieces have been primed, I'm going to go over everything again with the sander, making sure to vacuum up the dust as I go. Because this is a water-based primer, it raises the grain of the wood as it is applied. This quick-drying, high-solids primer sands very easily and also doubles as a grain filler, meaning that it will fill in the low spots in the grain when all the roughness and high spots are sanded down, leaving a smooth finish that is ready for the final layers of top coat. A good sanding approach is to be very methodical, moving in rows or columns across the surface rather than random willy-nilly patterns across the surface. This ensures that every inch of the surface is sanded and sanded evenly. After I sand down my primer, I am actually not going to use my sander again on any piece, unless there are any drips, runs, sags, or any other imperfections in the top coat layers. For sanding the primer, I will use anywhere from 180 to 220 grit sandpaper, as I still want enough grit to sand out imperfections, but not too much grit that I will burn through the primer and expose raw wood. After sanding all the flat faces, I will hand sand all the edges, as that gives me more control to sand the contours of the 1/16 round over without burning through the edges or actually sanding through and changing the profile of the round over. I began using a 1/16 round over on all my painted surfaces because the sharp edges have a tendency to not hold finish very well and chip and dent very easily, The small round over allows the finish to adhere better and will be more durable over time under daily wear and tear. After sanding down the primer, I'll begin spraying my top coat. Like I mentioned earlier, I have been primarily using Target Coatings water-based pigmented lacquer. It comes thin enough to spray through an HVLP system without thinning it down. It dries very quickly, and it has a 30-minute recoat time, meaning it is very easy to use and speeds up my production. Because these are my final top coats, I will strain the paint through a mesh filter every time that I fill up my gun in order to ensure that there are no foreign particles in the paint. This means that I should be able to spray my top coats without any sanding in between coats. The chemical makeup of this paint allows each layer to burn into the previous layer, eliminating the need for the mechanical bond that comes from scuff sanding between coats. Moving on to spraying my top coats, the focus is going to be on two things: building up the finish on the edges and keeping a consistent wet edge to avoid the laking effect of too much or too little product. So, for example, spraying a cabinet door starts at the edges, making sure that there is enough finish built up on all four edges, using an elevated turntable to be able to work all the way around the door. Or, in other words, I put an empty paint can on a Lazy Susan, allowing me to spin the door 360 degrees without having to move myself around the piece. It's a small thing that pays big dividends over multiple doors and drawer fronts. After coating the edges, I'll spray the face, being sure that I get paint into all the nooks and crannies of the frame and panel parts of the door. As I spray across the face of the door, I am sure to overlap my spray pattern by about 50% with each pass, chasing the wet edge across the face of the door and evenly applying the paint. You can actually see me chasing the wet edge across the side of this cabinet as I work from the bottom to the top of the side of the cabinet, being sure to overlap 50% with each pass. One difficulty in spraying a vertical surface is applying enough product to build up the proper wet mills without building up too much and having runs or sags. Spraying a horizontal surface is a little more forgiving, as the paint won't run or sag and will settle out a little more evenly and naturally due to gravity. A big downside of spraying a horizontal surface is that it is more likely to have dust and debris settle down on the wet or tacky paint, leaving a rough surface that needs to be sanded down before the next coat. One benefit of a quick drying paint is that this likelihood is reduced, albeit not completely removed. Watch how I spray this large piece. My first step is to make sure that there is enough product sprayed onto the edge of the cabinet before moving on to spraying the large horizontal face. Notice how I hold the gun as I paint across the piece. The nozzle of the gun held perpendicular, 90 degrees to the workpiece, with all the movement happening at the wrist and at the elbow, or my ankles. This gantry crane style ensures that the paint is applied evenly across the piece with each pass, chasing the wet edge across the piece and avoiding the zebra stripe effect of laking high and low buildup of paint. For those of you who are curious, the color is Flint by Benjamin Moore, which is a gray with dark blue undertones. We picked this color because it provides a strong contrast to the live edge elm desktop that I previously made for this home office. And if you didn't hear me mention it earlier in the video, I am spraying the parts in the cabinet case of the Murphy bed that will be the most important part of this home office build, as it will hopefully turn our home office into a functional guest room for visiting family and friends, while still allowing us to use this office for work. Spraying my second top coat layer is very similar to spraying my first top coat layer. These pieces will not need to be sanded down between coats because of both the unique burn-in technology of the paint, but also because I have taken the steps to ensure that there are no foreign particles either in the paint or on the workpiece. The second top coat layer will actually go on smoother than the first coat did, and will build up a slightly higher and more even sheen across the surface once it is completely dry. If you made it this far into the video, thank you. I really hope that I made good use of your time and that I was able to provide something of value, or at least a little insight into what goes on in my head and in my shop. If you'd like to see more videos on what I'm building, please hit the subscribe button and let me know what you would like to see. I enjoy making these videos, and if there is ever anything that you think I should change up or focus on with these videos, please let me know in the comments below and I will be sure to take it into consideration. As I finish up painting these pieces, I will let them all sit for a few days over the weekend to allow the paint to dry and to begin to cure before I load everything up and bring it all home to reassemble in place and mount to the wall. Hopefully all before we need to use this home office as a guest room.